Because over the past 3 weeks I've been able to pore over a few hundred pages of archival materials that were given to me through Zach Barsik and Ali Berzek copied them from the Tbilisi Archives, the Georgian State Archives in Tbilisi, and they complete a picture. The Russian genocide against the Circassians has always been difficult to chronicle because the Circassians had no written records on their own, and so you could only deal with official Russian reports. But with some new sources, I was able to put together, and particularly this archive, I'm beginning to complete the picture of exactly what happened and can draw up a pretty good, finally a good picture of what happened at the end. For those of you who aren't familiar with Circassia, it was on the eastern shore of the Black Sea, right about here. This is from a geography textbook, 1829, clearly marked as a nation. This is a more specific delineation of where the tribes, the Kabardians actually went further up here. This is a map after the Russians had already begun to take over, and the majority of the Circassians lived in this area along with their neighbors, the Abazas, and some other groups, the Karachais, and some mountain tribes unrelated. But these were from the Circassian homeland. This shows the Russian advance. This line here is after the construction of this line, the Labinsk line in 1858, and the construction of the Russian forts sealing off the coastal areas. The final attack on the Circassians began, and that's the period I'm dealing with. They were deported. The ones who survived the last years about which I'm going to talk, they were deported to points in Turkey and in European Ottoman Empire. From there they went to the Middle East and all over. In fact, the city of Misrata, Libya, was founded by Circassians. This is what's left of them in Circassia, and these are not solid Circassian areas. They're just where they inhabit. There's a few little regions here. I mean, there's only 5,000 in these three regions here, so they're almost gone in their homeland. I estimated that their population should be around 23 million by now, and there's probably about 500,000. The documents that I'm using, Milienti Alshevsky was the general in charge of the reserves. He's unknown. If you ask any Russian who are the generals in the Caucasus, they say, well, you have Yevdokimov, Milyutin, Philipson, Babich, of course, but Alshevsky was unknown, and his memoirs were pretty much forgotten until republished in 2003. The second source I'm not using in this particular presentation. The third source, Ivan Drozdov, was a participant. He was an officer in the Russian army, an eyewitness. He published his memoirs in 1877. I use Adolf Berger, who was the head of the Caucasus Archaeographical Commission during the entire war. He is very pro-Russian, but I use a little bit of his stuff in this presentation. But primarily, the new material is from the Georgian State Archives, Folder 2, Opus 1, document 1177. It is the field notes of the Field Commander, General Nikolai Yevdokimov, dated June 29th through December 12th, 1863. I'm going to go over a series of myths the Russians posed to argue that it was not genocide against the Circassians, and I'm going to show how the evidence clearly shows that this is not the case. Number one, the Russians argued the Circassians posed a clear danger to the Russian Empire. They were hostile, they attacked the Russian Empire, they were constantly in contact with the Turkish Empire, and therefore the Russians had to move them out of the coastal areas for security purposes. This was first formulated by General Rostislav Faddeev in his memoir published in the 1880s. It has been repeated by many, many scholars in Russia, all the way up to Mark Blieff's book in 2006. However, the evidence shows, and particularly the documents from the Georgian State Archive, that during the 1863 campaign, the Dakovsky detachment, which was the main regiment, met no organized resistance. In 200 pages, there is not one battle. There are snipers, there are gangs of little 5, 10, 15 people, but no army whatsoever. The shore was completely sealed off by the Russian troops. The Russians had moved the army from the Crimean War over and sealed the shore off. There was no contact between the Turks and the Circassians. All that remained were villagers. Here's a couple excerpts. By May 1863, this is from Drozdov, the Russians completely occupied Shekh Valley. This is along the coast. The Russians moved forwards towards the Pshish River under Major General Zotov. The Circassian elders came to the Russians daily, begging and threatening them not to destroy the forest. We're not seeing resistance. We're seeing old people coming out and asking them to stop. There was one last battle in May 20th, old style, about 12 days off. 5,000 Circassians were routed by Russian cannon fire, and after this they began surrendering. That's Dроздов. This is from Georgian State Archives. This is a quote from General Yevdokimov. The military actions carried out by the army of the Kuban Oblast, that's county, during the summer of this year have placed the mountaineers of the North Face in an inescapable position and have deprived them of not only the possibility but also the hope of engaging us in battle. So what the Russians were dealing with, and this is a 40,000-man army, they're dealing with unarmed, for the most part, unarmed villagers. They're not dealing with a military force at all. So we're dealing with a civilian population. Second myth, the Circassians were offered fertile lands. The Russians say, hey, we told them they could move to the north of the Kuban. And Berger mentions this is all black earth, beautiful, wonderful territory. They've been prospered there. This is also repeated in a very long, kind of tearful tract by Mark Lee, how sad they didn't take our offer because we wanted the best for them. However, the area north of the Kuban, Olszewski's reserves were stationed there. And he gives us a very clear account. Here's his own words. The squares of Katerina Dar were impassable because of filth and swampiness. This occurred because of the frequent rains. Illnesses, especially fever due to the miasmas hidden in the swamps and quagmires in the city itself, and the surrounding bogs and reeds, heat and suffocating air from poisonous fumes rising from the bogs and swamps. Throughout the year, they were not only impassable but difficult to move in due to mud and quagmires. Moving away from Ekaterina Dar, the countryside became more lifeless and yellowed. After passing the Zavetinskaya Stanitsa Cossack village, there were swamps and sandy fields filled with silt. Just after the Kapilskaya postal station was a kingdom of mosquitoes. This was the area, and later on in his memoirs, Olszewski says, this is what we offered the Circassians, and if I have a chance, I'll give the quote. He says, how could we have ever dreamed they would have accepted that? So the offer of moving them to the lowlands was really a fraud. And the Circassians well knew what this area was. It was an uninhabitable area. And so the offer of Yevdokimov to transport them there, they knew that it was completely in bad faith. Okay. Myth number 3. The Russians were taken by surprise by the number of Circassians who chose to emigrate. In his official documents, his official report, Yevdokimov said, I only expect 10,000 to want to emigrate. The rest will voluntarily move to the lowlands. Berger repeats this in a text he wrote, an article he wrote in the 1880s. Blief repeats it, and an American scholar, Dana Sherry, repeats this argument in an article she wrote in 2009. There was a companion argument that's repeated by all these people, including Sherry. This was clearly a voluntary choice. Even though the Russians kind of compelled them out of their homeland, they chose to go to the country of their co-religionists. It was a hijra. In fact, Sherry even uses that word. They went as an act of hijra to the Muslim lands. The evidence here is Berger, in his memoir, also mentions that Yevdokimov's private opinion was that the majority would emigrate, but he, in his official documents, he said only 10,000. But the rumors were flying that he knew that more would emigrate than that, much more. Also, the Russian High Command also believed this as well. This is something Olszewski brings up. And the Circassians emigrated because they hated the Russians, not because they had no desire to live in a land where people who had been fighting them for 100 years and killing them. And this is repeated by all of the memoirs. Here's Olszewski's. The second quote, because I'll probably run out of time. Didn't exchanging their cherished mountains and forests full of health, freedom, and independence for the noxious Black Sea plains and swampy lowlands of the Bolshaya Lava, this is a Russian general, mean giving themselves up as victims of fever? And really, if the Cossacks who were born in the miasmas or migrated there from the steppes fell ill in terrible numbers there, then what sort of effect would the miasmas have on the inhabitants of the mountains who would always breathe fresh, healthy air? And again, this is a Russian general who was loyal, very loyal general, who was just presenting his case. From Drozdov's memoirs, eyewitness. The first sentence is my summary, just kind of placing context. Circassians were given the choice to be settled where the Russians ordered them or to go to Turkey, and now Dроздов. The latter group, which constituted the majority of the population, were burning with hatred of us to the last minute, so much so that they didn't even try to conceal their feelings, expressing it in curses and generously heaping them on us, the involuntary cause of their deportation. And so this is a Russian eyewitness. The reason the Circassians emigrated was because they did not trust the Russians and they hated the Russians. It wasn't hijra, it was hatred. So that's the case there. This is the one that really is debunked by the Georgian State Archives. The Russians were concerned about the welfare of the Circassians. They meant well. It was an accident. The whole tragedy was something that went out of control because they didn't plan it well, but they really meant well, and it was the Turks' fault. It was the British fault. It was the Circassians' fault themselves. But they gave them a choice of where they wished to go, and they all chose to go to the seacoast, but they did what they could to help them. The evidence clearly demonstrates Yevdokimov acted in gross disregard and even contempt for the lives of his own men, for the settlers, and the Circassians. And again, I'd like to start with a quote from Olszewski. Well, this is a summary. At the beginning of November 1861, the Russian assault on Circassia began. Yevdokimov wanted to complete the ethnic cleansing of the Fars and Belaya region by March and drove his men so hard that Olszewski reports at one point the troops almost mutinied. When he was told of the high illness rate among his troops, Yevdokimov's response was, and this is a quote by Olszewski who witnessed it, "Let them die at work." Illnesses and deaths occurred at an astronomical rate. Olszewski also reports, I'll summarize this quickly, he wanted the area colonized. This was the strategy. Put in Russian Cossack colonies as rapidly as possible so the Circassians couldn't come back. He did it so quickly, he did not establish communication lines, he did not secure the area. So he moved in 10, 12 villages of 150 to 300 families of Cossacks, unarmed Cossacks, before the area was secured. And so they were so under attack by the remaining Circassians, trying to get their land back, at one point they simply gave up going outside because they were constantly being killed and taken captive, and they starved, their animals starved. Again, this is General Olszewski's report. So the reason I bring this up, if this is how Yevdokimov treated his troops, if this is how Yevdokimov treated the Cossack settlers, how could anyone in his right mind think that he would have humanitarian concern for the enemy? And as we go into the Georgian State Archives, it's clear he didn't, but this is the most interesting part of all. I had a hard time figuring out what was going on here. But after reading the whole summary of the 200 pages, it really came clear. Between the 24th and 29th of August, old style, 1863, the Dakovsky detachment burned all the owls of Circassian villages called an owl along the Shekots River as the Abzaks, one of the tribes, watched helplessly. This was cryptic. Where are they watching from? In other places, Yevdokimov clearly delineates how many people he captured, men and women, and what they did with them. Here over and over in these memoirs, he just says, and they watched. We met no resistance from them. Where were they? What did they do with them? And it was very difficult to figure out at first, but I eventually did. For example, here, it shows the Natuhais. All the owls were destroyed along the Abina River, 289 families captured. They continued searching, found 47 people hiding in the most hidden places. So, on September 10th, 1863, the Russians found, this is one thing I found over and over, found several recently built huts at the source of the Pshetsuk River. I practiced that all night long. Where they had passed already on the 5th. They burned them. This is where I was beginning to figure out what was going on. They would go up the river valleys. The Circassians who were unarmed fled into the woods. They would burn the villages. They would destroy the food, destroy the hay, rustle the cattle, and leave the Circassians up there to freeze, starve, be eaten by wolves. There's reports of that, or surrender. And so this continued on all through the fall. I have another example, and then now we're November 1863. 3 companies searched the Adits River Valley for any Circassians that might be hiding in the thickets. They found and destroyed a small number of dwellings. The The Circassians themselves were at the very highest places and shot at the Russians when they came near. The Russians found 5 Circassian corpses and took 8 prisoners, people of both sexes, prisoner. Yevdokimov notes that these were so difficult to reach, their horses were dropping dead from exhaustion. That's how thoroughly they were scouring this region, looking for any Circassian. It continues on. They kept going up these river valleys, destroying every owl they found, and then waiting for the Circassians to come back to build temporary dwellings, come back, destroy those, and so on. And now we're in December. It's still going on. The Czech detachment under General Grabe moved into Sochi River Valley. They took some Circassian families, number 40 persons prisoner, and this is how bad it's getting. Picture these people in the hills trying to survive with no dwellings. The night was very cold. The prisoners, quote, barely covered in rags, this is Drozdov, fell from exhaustion. Mothers held the dead babies in their arms. Our hearts wrung with pain looking at these unfortunate souls, but we couldn't help them. So this is what Drozdov saw going on. Actually on time for once. Actually, what he saw was going on, and still, they continued down. Immediately afterwards, they continued in February and March to continue the expulsion, if need be, by force, and continued to burn the owls in the Chilipse and Tuapse River Valley, which seemed to be abandoned, but they weren't sure if they'd killed everybody or driven everyone out. Now, this isn't a great example. In an act of what he considered mercy, on September 12, 1863, Yevdokimov gave Abzak villagers between the Shek and Sich rivers a 5-day notice to give them time to move their owls to the right bank of the Pshish, where they would be deported from. Quote, because the Abzaks never exhibited any military opposition and had always fulfilled our demands, end quote. These are people who have never fired a shot at the Russians. And yet, on the same day, the Abzak elders approached Yevdokimov and asked that they be allowed to stay till spring. He refused. The next day they returned and explained there would be tremendous suffering if they moved now because of the impending onset of winter. All he agreed to was to send a pristav, a commandant, to, quote, lighten their difficult situation and create order among them, in order that they may accept and fulfill our demands, end quote. Villagers who'd never fired a shot at the Russians, who had always obeyed their orders, he ordered them down the hills to their deaths at the beaches of the Black Sea. Last minute, I probably have just enough time to go through this quickly. The massive amounts of deaths of people waiting for ships was the result of bad weather and the intransigence of the Turkish skippers, things the Russians could not have foreseen. However, the evidence clearly shows this is all Olszewski now. Yevdokimov deliberately forced large numbers of Circassians into a small space, refused to allow them to disperse, refused to allow them to go back into the hills so they could build shelters, and it happened at the worst possible time of the year, despite repeated warnings. Here's a long quote by Olszewski, but I just want to summarize. He just kept forcing the people into this the Tuapse River, the only point designated for departure to Turkey. So he was pressing tens of thousands of people into this one point. And the second paragraph, just as the worst of the winter storms began to hit the coastal Shapsuks, as another tribe, as well as those who lived along the tributaries of the Kuban and the Abzaks, so from the river valleys on the north side of the Caucasus Ridge, were forced down to the mouth of the Tuapse as well. This is hundreds of thousands of people. They were pressed, quote, in the open air, constantly pierced by a cold wind, flooded by frequent rain, suffering from lack of provisions and lacking hot food. Olszewski watched as, quote, children, women, and the elderly fell seriously ill and died, primarily of typhus and dysentery, and he notes the entire shore was covered with graves. As soon as these people were sent off, 20,000 more arrived. Yevdokimov continued to push, even though he saw what had happened already. He didn't slow down. And the final comment of Olszewski. Why did it happen? This is a quote. Why did it happen that the Dakovsky detachment went without bread, salt, and vodka for several days, and the Abzaks and Shapsuks, who were being driven from their homelands, suffered such horrific sufferings and deaths? I think he phrases that way as a kind of irony. I think he really disapproved of what was happening, and so he phrased it in a kind of an ironic sense. But here's his condemnation of Yevdokimov. It was exclusively because of the hurried and premature movement of our troops to the sea prior to the spring equinox. Had the Dakovsky detachment moved a month or 2 weeks later, this would not have happened. So Olszewski clearly places the blame on Yevdokimov. Yevdokimov received repeated warnings that this would happen. He went ahead with it. There's another quote I didn't incorporate here that was published long ago by Stephen Shenfield, the grandfather of studies of the Circassian Genocide, where Yevdokimov said, okay, well, this is a tragedy, but just keep it going. There's nothing we can do about it now. A very cynical quote. Conclusion. The Tbilisi Archives contain a great deal of information that will complete the picture of what happened between the years 1861 and 1864 when the Circassian Genocide was occurring. From the 200 pages I read, and I have hundreds of pages more to go through, it clearly points the finger at General Nikolai Yevdokimov as the engineer, the main culprit, but the Russian army collaborated. I don't know if there's any information leading back to Alexander II. I don't know whether there will be or not, but clearly this archive needs to be explored more thoroughly. And hopefully this entire picture will come out to show that this is probably the first modern genocidal act. I don't know of any prior to it. I know the American acts against the natives was happening contemporaneously to this. So we have these two acts as probably the first modern genocides and should be recognized as such. And that's it. That's for time. My first time in my life.
15 minutos para, we have 15 minutes for discussion, so I invite you to answer, to make questions.
Thank you. Those were all excellent presentations and fascinating. I was wondering, and this could possibly be for both of you, but it's obviously a very politically intense environment right now in Russia as far as being aware of this research and this political issue. Have you, Walt, had any discourse with politicians or people in Russia about your latest archival work, or what's your sense of how this is going to be reacted to when you come out with more of this? Is this going to be something that you're worried about in any way, or that worried about how you'll be able to get that information disseminated?
I don't have any hope that any of my research will make any kind of impact on Russian society. It's far too controlled, and it will continue to be controlled. I would expect that when my book comes out, the Russian government will have an official response and encourage people like Bliev to denounce it as being connected to the CIA and things like that. I deliberately avoid talking to politicians, particularly U.S. politicians. Although I like their work, I deliberately avoid contact with the Jamestown Foundation because the Russians immediately use that as an excuse. Oh, he's in touch with the Jamestown. He obviously works for the U.S. government. So I stay away from them, not for any reason of disliking them, but simply because I would try to maintain this position that I'm just an independent scholar. I came across this material and I'm revealing it. I don't expect Russia to have any kind of response other than very negative to what I'm doing. In the case I'm setting up, I have no intention of changing the Russians' minds. I know it won't. I'm just trying to present a case to the rest of the world to show how ridiculous their positions are. That's it.
And recently, in reaction to the genocide recognition, members of the Duma actually stated that the Circassian delegation that went there were traitors to their own nation for trying to get recognition for this genocide. So obviously it's going to be very negative going forward. Yeah.
They made fun of Tamara on Russian TV too, because she was at the Sochi Olympics. I mean, they were protesting Sochi in Vancouver, and they were saying, "Look at how loud she's shouting. She must have taken singing lessons for this." Yeah, so. Yeah.
Okay. Jorge,
the Crimean Tatars were also deported around the same time. Large numbers of them remained, but a larger percentage of them, the Circassians. And you're absolutely right. This is probably a systemic decision made in St. Petersburg. These archives were really pointing the finger at Yevdokimov, and what I really wanted to uncover was the specifics of what he was doing in the mountains. That was something that we all knew what was happening, but we didn't have the evidence, and this is the specific evidence. And so that's why in this talk I was pointing straight at him. But certainly, it trails back up through Miliutin, through Baryatinsky, and then through the Grand Prince and back to the Emperor. And I'm sure it's tied to the Crimean Tatars. My good friend J. Otto Pohl wrote quite a bit on the Crimean Tatars deportation. I'm not as familiar with it as he is, unfortunately, so I can't comment much further than that.